Hey guys, are you ready to go on an adventure of learning? Because I'm about to go on a safari of teaching. Well, maybe not so exciting, but we're definitely going to do a Supreme Court decision that you need to know if you're in an American history course or you're walking around on planet Earth and you like your history. And that would be the Dred Scott decision, or Scott versus Sandford of 1857. So we're going to kind of take a look back in history, guys, take a look at the facts of the case, definitely look at the Supreme Court decision and what the decision actually said, and then most importantly, we'll look at the effect of that decision and we'll do some bang bang for the learning. So why don't you go get the door, because I think it's here. Go answer the door. All right, so let's go over the very basic facts of the case so we can understand what the Supreme Court decision is all about. Dred Scott was born around 1800 and around 1820, right at the time of the Missouri Compromise, which is going to be really important in this story. His owner, Peter Blow, takes Dred Scott to the territory of Missouri, which now is a slave territory. He is then sold, as a slave to an army sergeant in the American Army, John Emerson. And John Emerson then ends up moving shortly after to Illinois. And Illinois, according to the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, comes into the Union in 1819 as a free state. So not only is Dred Scott going to be a slave in a free state for a little while, but his owner, John Emerson, is then going to take him to what was then the Wisconsin territory. Later was going to be, I guess, part of Minnesota. But either way, we're really testing the Missouri Compromise, because that territory, the Wisconsin territory, is free territory according to that line drawn out by the Missouri Compromise in 1820. What ends up happening is around 1837, I believe that Emerson goes back to Louisiana. He's in the Army. He ends up dying, I believe, in the Seminole War with the Native American tribes down in Florida, somewhere around there. But his wife, Eliza Emerson, actually leased out Dred Scott and his family in Wisconsin for a little while, and then ended up bringing the family back to Louisiana and then ending up in Missouri. And I know along the way, Dred Scott had a child named Eliza that was born in the Mississippi, and that child was born in free territory as well, which just kind of adds to the mix of the story. And what ends up happening is the state of Missouri, in the court case Scott versus Emerson, because remember, his owner was Eliza Emerson, ended up finding that Dred Scott was still going to be a slave, even though Missouri precedent, kind of previous decisions, had favored emancipation in these incidences. Because slavery has become such a hot topic with the expansion issues and the compromise issues of 1850 and the Missouri Compromise, Missouri is basically claiming, slaves back. Once you're a slave, if you come back, you're going to be a slave. And remember, we also have the Fugitive Slave Act on the front burner as well. So at this point, Dred Scott is going to turn his attention to the Supreme Court. And at that time period, I believe that Emerson, the wife, had transferred custody of Dred Scott to a new owner, who would be Sandford, John Sandford, who was Eliza's brother, who was a citizen of New York, and that's actually important too. But now you have it. You have Scott versus Sandford, Dred Scott versus his owner, John Sandford. And the Supreme Court trial begins. Ding, ding, ding. Let's keep going. All right, guys, so now we're at the Supreme Court. This is a federal trial now, and we have Scott versus Sandford. 3 questions are being tossed around by Roger Taney, the Taney Court, the Chief Justice, and the first one is that of jurisdiction. Does Dred Scott, as a citizen, as he sees it, of Missouri, have a right to have standing in this court case? According to Article 3, Section 2, if you're a citizen of one state and you have a lawsuit or a pending suit against a citizen of another state, that can be a federal court hearing. You can have a Supreme Court case on that. The second question will be that of whether Congress has the constitutional ability to regulate slavery in the territories, i.e. is the Missouri Compromise and even the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Does that pass constitutional measure? Can Congress limit the scope of slavery in these new states? And then finally, is Dred Scott free? Is Dred Scott free if he left and stayed in a free state and now he's returning to a slave state? So I think what's important to understand as we go out and explain these decisions is really the context of the times. James Buchanan, who was elected president as the Supreme Court was hearing this court case, and remember, there's a long lame duck kind of session. So he's elected in November of 1856. He's not going to take office till March 4th of 1857. So in that time period, there is evidence that Buchanan was talking to Supreme Court justices. There's evidence that Robert Cooper Greer, one of the Supreme Court justices from the North, was having correspondence with James Buchanan because James Buchanan wanted this issue settled. And he wanted a Northerner to side with the majority on the court so it didn't look like it was a sectional decision, because he doesn't want to deal with this issue anymore that he sees as ripping kind of the country apart, this issue of slavery. He wants the Supreme Court to make a decision and close the door so the country can move forward with slavery or without slavery, but he sees it as with slavery. So here's the awful decision. It's a 7-2 decision. Number one, they state that Dred Scott's not a citizen, that this is really racist language they use. They go back to kind of writings and ramblings of the Founding Fathers talking about the white race being superior and that Negroes and their descendants have no claim to citizenship. That they might be emancipated in certain states, the Taney says, but they don't have citizenship rights. And therefore, they don't really even have the legitimacy to bring this to trial. So therefore, the suit is basically dismissed. That's probably where it should have been. If it stayed there, it still would have been a terrible decision, but there would have been no precedent set. There would have been no kind of pushing the nation into kind of a iron clasp decision on slavery one way or the other. But then the Taney Court goes on to say that the Missouri Compromise, that Congress's ability to regulate slaves kind of issues in the territories, is unconstitutional. This is only the second time that the Supreme Court is using its power of judicial review to find a federal act, a congressional act, unconstitutional. The first one being Marbury versus Madison. And now here we are, I don't want to do the math in my head, 40, 50 years later, and the Supreme Court's doing it again, but this time on the Missouri Compromise. And that's going to have humongous effects. And also, by saying that, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is also going to be unconstitutional. Now, we're going to talk about the effects in a second, so I'm going to save myself. But the third issue of whether Dred Scott is slave or free, they basically state that since we have no right to hear this court case, that the standing in Missouri, when it was Scott versus Emerson, stands. That he is a slave, and we ain't going to do nothing to change that. So there you go. You have the most terrible decision in the history of the United States in the Supreme Court. Now, most importantly, you want to remember kind of the basic idea if you're taking a test in the morning or something like that. They said slaves are property. That slaves are property, and that the owner's decision to bring that slave into a free territory and then come back, that's still their property. And that no legislative act by Congress is going to change that. So we've basically pushed the country now to the next level, and let's take a look at what that next level entails. All right, the effects are big time. First of all, I think it's really telling that Roger Taney, the guy who made this decision, is seen whispering into President-elect James Buchanan's ear on March 4th, the inauguration day of 1857, basically saying, yo bro, we got this thing locked in. These two knuckleheads, Buchanan and Taney, think that this decision is going to kind of sew this nation back together, and that the Civil War, which might have been unavoidable, will now be avoidable because of their mastery of judicial review. Of course, the decision is going to have the complete opposite effect. And 2 days later, on March 6th of 1857, the nation kind of enters into the final phase, moving towards the Civil War. Number one, it's going to piss off abolitionists. Like the John Brown raid is what? The next year? 2 years later? And I'm sure John Brown, when this decision came out, probably made the mental decision, that's it, I'm done. And of course, you also have Southerners who feel emboldened too. And they're even thinking about trying to overturn decisions that would allow them to bring their slaves to New York City. And seeing the possibility of slavery now basically being everywhere. And of course, that's going to scare the hell out of the North. You also have to remember, guys, that if slavery is going to expand out west and the Dred Scott decision is going to allow that you're going to have more of a slave population, hence the census is going to be affected. Remember the 3/5 compromise back from the olden days of the Constitutional Convention is going to kick in, and therefore for every 5 slaves, you're going to get 3 reps for that state, and if it's a slave state, obviously that's not good for northern interests. This leads also to really Lincoln, I think, taking a firmer stance on the issue of slavery with his nation divided speech, really mentioning the Dred Scott decision and how dangerous this is for the Supreme Court to really kind of mute the legislative and executive branches from dealing with this issue. And at the same time, I think emboldening the Republican Party to take a firmer stand on this idea of free soil and this idea of slavery not being left into the territories. And I think that, combined with John Brown, and now combined with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1861, him taking office, is going to lead to the direct secession of those southern states into the Civil War. So to end this story kind of with a circle, we'll go back to the beginning. Peter Blow, the original owner of Dred Scott, after the Dred Scott decision, purchases his former slave's freedom, his emancipation. Dred Scott then ends up living in St. Louis. He died, unfortunately, 18 months after this decision. But the decision is going to be the bang-bang for the Civil War. And now you know the Dred Scott decision, Scott versus Sanford, guys. What you're going to do when the learning comes for you. I'm done with the teaching. We hope you did a little bit of the learning. The Dred Scott decision, baby. If you haven't checked out Hip Use History, click my face. It's free. It's on YouTube. It's what all the cool kids are doing because cat videos are so 2010. Where attention goes, energy flows, guys. Make sure you check the description below. We have other links to learn in there for you. I'm going to go because I got other stuff to be doing. We'll see you next time on the YouTubes.